All right, we're back. Welcome and back to Fraggoth Reads. I'm Fraggoth, and today we're reading the penultimate, that is, second to last installment of Distress by Greg Egan. So previously on, things got exciting in a big way. So our boy Andrew Worth and Akili Kuwale had been kidnapped by anthrocosmologists, the quote moderate faction of anthrocosmologists who only want to kill Violet Mosala because she'll end the universe, because she may or may not be the keystone. So Andrew Worth manages to biohack, open up his abdominal cavity and pull out a data lead, an optical fiber lead, and connect it to the boat's cargo bay subsystems, which allowed him to send out a distress beacon, flares, and another distress beacon, which sends a bunch of people showing up from Stateless to the boat where they've been imprisoned, and they do manage to get away, but Andrew Worth has to pull out further techno-disembowel himself by pulling out more of his robo-guts that allow him to do his camera work, because they don't believe he's deleted the interview that they did. Meanwhile, Stateless has been invaded, and for Andrew Worth, that is rather traumatic and disconcerting, with a bunch of techno-mercenaries who have taken over the airport and generally being around and being scary. But for the residents of Stateless, it is Tuesday. This happens a lot. The invading mercenaries, typically paid for by ingenuity or some other concern that doesn't want them around because they threaten them in some way. Their very existence is deemed threatening by the capitalist powers that run the world. They do this a lot, and they usually fail within 6 months. Andrew Worth is not terribly reassured by this, particularly given that Violet Mosala is now appears to have come down with some sort of bug. Possibly the same one that he was infected with, though it's not clear at this time. And because the mercenaries have the airport, they can't readily get her out of there to go to a place with better medical facilities. So he parlays with the mercenaries, who are more technologically advanced than even he was dreading, to the point where he's like, this is probably pretty bad. But he does manage to negotiate with them, to let Violet Mosala take off in a plane and get healed somewhere, and he's making that gamble with the hope that whoever is actually funding these mercenaries would rather have Violet Mosala not be a martyr for Stateless, and die somewhere else, if possible. Or preferably not die at all, because she's planning on emigrating. In the background, the pathology of the distress disease, or whatever you want to call it, seems to have escalated and changed a little bit. Now people who have it will start rambling on and on about how, basically describing the cosmology that makes the image before their eyes exist. And that's pretty spooky, and it certainly has Akili Kuwale spooked. And Kuwale says something along the lines of, the Keystone's Aleph point will move forward and backward through time. The wavefront will go backward through time, so they're trying to quickly figure out how far in the future, how much time they've got before the Keystone does something that causes distress to occur. because that is the running assumption now, that distress is caused by the Keystone doing their thing. But Andrew Worth has other concerns on his mind at this point. Many other concerns. So that gets us up to date, I think. So let's go. Let me just slurp some water into my mouth parts and engage my brain elements, and we will get rockin' with the rollin'. Chapter 26. I told de Groot I'd catch some sleep and be back by 2:30. I wanted to bid Mosala bon voyage. I went looking for Akili to tell Ver the good news, but V'd been discharged. I sent Ver a message, then returned to the hotel, washed my face, and changed my laser-singed shirt. My burns were numb, absent. The local anesthetic had magicked them away. I felt battered but triumphant, and too wired to stand still, let alone sleep. It was almost 11, but the shops were still open. I went out and bought myself another shoulder camera, then wandered the city, filming everything in sight. The last night of peace on Stateless? The mood on the streets was nothing like the atmosphere of siege among the physicists and journalists inside the hotel, but there was an edge of nervous anticipation, like Los Angeles during a quake risk alert. I'd been through one, a false alarm. When people met my gaze, they seemed curious, even suspicious, but they showed no sign of hostility. It was as if they thought I might, conceivably, be a spy for the mercenaries, but if I was, that was merely an exotic trait which they had no intention of holding against me. I stopped in the middle of a brightly lit square and checked the news nets. Buzo had given no press conference admitting his error, but with Mosala now showing symptoms, perhaps he'd take the risk of the extremists seriously and reconsider. Coverage of the situation on Stateless stank, uniformly, but CNET would soon scoop everyone by announcing the real reasons for the occupation. And even with Mosala alive, the truth might come out badly for the pro-boycott alliance. The air was humid but cold. I stared up at the satellites which bridged the planet and tried to make sense of the fact that I was standing on an artificial South Pacific island on the eve of a war. Was my whole life encoded in this moment? The memories I possessed, the circumstances I found myself in? Taking this much and no more as given, could I have reconstructed all the rest? It didn't feel that way. My childhood in Sydney was unimaginable, as remote and hypothetical as the Big Bang, and even the time I'd spent in the hold on the fishing boat and the encounter with the robot at the airport had receded like fragments of a dream. I'd never had cholera. I possessed no internal organs. The stars glinted icily. At 1 in the morning, the streets were still crowded, shops and restaurants still trading. Nobody seemed as somber as they should have been. Maybe they still believed that they were facing nothing more than the kind of harassment they'd survived before. There was a group of young men standing around a fountain in the square, joking and laughing. I asked them if they thought the militia would attack the airport soon. I couldn't imagine why else they'd be in such high spirits. Maybe they'd be taking part and were psyching themselves up for it. They stared at me in disbelief. Attack the airport? And get slaughtered? It might be your only chance. They exchanged amused glances. One of them put a hand on my shoulder and said solicitously, "Everything's gonna be just fine. Just keep an ear to the ground and hang on tight." I wondered what kind of drugs they were on.
When I returned to the hospital, de Groot said, "Violet's awake. She wants to talk with you." I went in alone. The room was dimly lit. A monitor near the head of the bed glowed with green and orange data. Mosala's voice was weak, but she was lucid. "Will you ride in the ambulance with me?" "If that's what you want." "I want you to record everything. Just make good use of it if you have to." "I will." I wasn't sure exactly what she meant. Framing ingenuity for her death, if it came to that? I didn't press her for details. I was weary of the politics of martyrdom. "Karine said you went to the airport and petitioned the mercenaries on my behalf." She searched my face. "Why?" "I was returning a favor." She laughed softly. "What did I ever do to deserve that?" It's a long story. And I was no longer sure, myself, whether I'd been trying to repay Adele Vunibobo, doing it all for the Techno-Liberation, acting out of respect and admiration for Mosala, or hoping to impress Achille by saving the Keystone, even if the role was beginning to sound less like a revered creator than a kind of information-theoretic typhoid Mary. De Groot came in with news of the flight. Everything was on schedule, and it was time to leave. 2 medics joined us. I stood back, filming with the shoulder camera as Mosala was moved to a trolley, monitor and drug pumps still attached. In the garage, on the way to the ambulance, I saw half a dozen balloon-tired vehicles. My brain was like, how is a balloon tired, and why are the vehicles that way? Not thinking that, the vehicles have tires that are like balloons. Sleepy balloons. In the garage, on the way to the ambulance, I saw half a dozen balloon-tired vehicles being loaded with medical equipment, bandages, and drugs. Maybe they were moving supplies to other sites around the city, in case the hospital was captured. It was heartening to see that not everyone was taking the invasion lightly. We rode through the city slowly, without the siren wailing. More people were on the streets than I'd ever seen by daylight. Mosala asked de Groot for a notepad, then put it on the mattress beside her, and turned onto her side so she could type. Whatever she was doing seemed to demand intense concentration, but she spoke to me without looking away from the screen. "You suggested that I appoint a successor, Andrew, someone to make sure that the work was finished. Well, I'm arranging that now." I couldn't see the point anymore, but I didn't argue. A high-resolution scan in Cape Town would yield structures for all the viral proteins almost immediately, and precision drugs to block their actions could be designed and synthesized in a matter of hours. Proving the moderates wrong and then begging them for the cure was no longer any kind of shortcut. Mosala glanced up at me and spoke for the camera. "The software is working on 10 canonical experiments. A full analysis of all of them, combined, will yield what used to be thought of as the 10 parameters of total space, the details of the 10-dimensional geometry which underlies all the particles and forces. In modern terms, those 10 experiments reveal, between them, exactly how the symmetry of pre-space is broken for us, exactly what it is that everything in this universe has in common." "I understand." She shook her head impatiently. "Let me finish. What's running on the supercomputer network right now is just brute force calculations. I wanted the software to leave the honors to me, double-checking, pulling it all together, writing a paper which set out the results in a way which would make sense to anyone. But those things are trivial. I already know exactly what has to be done with the results once they're available, and—" She executed a flurry of keystrokes, scrutinized the effects, and then put the notepad aside. All of it has just been automated. My mother gave me a pre-release Caspar clonlet last week, and it'll probably write up the results more smoothly than I ever could. So whether I'm alive, dead, or somewhere in between, by 6 a.m. on Friday, that paper will be written and posted on the nets with toll-free universal access. Copies will also be sent to every faculty member and every student of the physics departments of every university on the planet." She flashed a smile of pure, defiant glee. "What are the anthro-cosmologists going to do now? Kill every physicist on the planet?" I glanced up at de Groot, who was tight-lipped and ashen. Mosala groaned. Oh, don't look so damn morbid, you two. I'm just covering all contingencies. She closed her eyes. Her breathing was ragged, but she was still smiling. I turned to the monitor. Her temperature was 40.9 degrees. That's Celsius, which is hot. We'd left the city behind. The windows of the ambulance showed nothing but our reflections. The ride was smooth, the engine all but silent. After a while, I thought I could hear the reef rock itself exhaling through a distant borehole, but then I realized that it was the whine of the approaching jet. Mosala had lost consciousness, and no one tried to rouse her. We reached the rendezvous point, and I climbed out quickly to cover the landing, more because of the promise I'd made than out of any real vestige of professionalism. The plane descended vertically, just 40 or 50 meters away from us, gray fuselage lit by nothing but moonlight, the VTOL engines blasting a fine caustic dust of limestone out of the matrix of the rock. I wanted to savor this moment of victory, but the sight of the sleek military craft landing in darkness in the middle of nowhere made my heart sink. I imagined it would be the same with the naval evacuation. The outside world was going to tiptoe in, gather up its own people, and leave. The anarchists could take what was coming to them. The two men who descended first wore officers' uniforms and sidearms, but they might have been doctors. They took the medics aside and spoke in a huddle, their voices lost beneath the hum of the jets. Air was still being forced through the stationary engines to keep them cool. Then a slender young man in rumpled civilian clothes emerged, looking haggard and disoriented. It took me a few seconds to recognize him. It was Mosala's husband, Macompo. De Groot met him. They embraced silently. I stayed back as she led him to the ambulance. I turned and looked away across the gray and silver reef rock. Threads of scattered trace minerals caught up the moonlight, shining like the foam on an impossibly tranquil ocean. When I turned back, the soldiers were carrying Mosala, bound to a stretcher, up into the plane. Macompo and de Groot followed. I suddenly felt very tired. De Groot came down the steps and approached me, shouting, "Are you coming with us? They say there's plenty of room." I stared back at her. What was there to keep me here? My contract with CNET was to make a profile of Mosala, not to record the fall of Stateless. The invisible insect had forbidden me to join the flight, but would the mercenaries have any way of knowing if I did? Stupid question. Outdoors, military satellites could just about fingerprint people and lip-read their conversations, all in infrared. But would they shoot down the plane, undermining the whole PR exercise and inviting retribution, just to punish one obscure journalist? No. I said, "I wish I could, but there's someone here I can't leave behind." De Groot nodded, needing no further explanation, and shook my hand, smiling. "Good luck to both of you, then. I hope we'll see you in Cape Town soon." "So do I." The two medics were silent as we rode back to the hospital. I felt certain that they wanted to talk about the war, but not in front of a foreigner. I scanned through the footage I'd taken with the shoulder camera, not yet trusting the unfamiliar technology, then dispatched it to my console at home. The city was more crowded than ever. The city was more crowded than ever, though there were fewer people on their feet now. Most were camping out on the streets, with sleeping bags, folding chairs, portable stoves, and even some small tents. I didn't know whether to feel encouraged by this or depressed at the pathetic optimism it implied. Maybe the anarchists were prepared to make the best of it if the city's infrastructure was seized. And I'd still seen no evidence of panic, riots, or looting, so maybe Monroe was right, and their education in the origins and dynamics of these revered human cultural activities was enough to empower them with the ability to think through the consequences, and decline to take part. But in the face of $1 billion worth of military hardware, they were going to need a lot more than stoves, tents, and sociobiology to avoid being slaughtered. Chapter 27. I was woken by the shelling. The rumbling sounded distant, but the bed was shaking. I dressed in seconds, then stood in the middle of the room, paralyzed by indecision. There were no basements here, no bomb shelters, so where was the safest place to be? Down on the ground floor, or out on the street? I balked at the prospect of exposure, but would 4 or 5 stories over my head offer any real protection, or just a heavier pile of rubble? It was just after 6, barely light. I moved to the window cautiously, fighting down an absurd fear of snipers, as if anyone from either side would bother. 5 columns of white smoke hung in the middle distance, funneling out from hidden apexes like languid tornadoes. I asked Sisyphus to scan the local nets for close-up vision. Dozens of people had posted footage. Reef rock was resilient and non-flammable, but the shells must have been spiked with some chemical agent tailored to inflict damage beyond the reach of mere heat and percussion, because the results looked less like shattered buildings than mine tailings dumped on empty lots. I couldn't imagine anyone surviving inside, but the adjacent streets hadn't fared much better, buried meters deep in chalk dust. The people camped outside the hotel showed no sign that they'd been taken by surprise. Half of them were already packed and moving, but the rest were taking down their tents, rolling up blankets and sleeping bags, disassembling stoves. I could hear young children crying, and the mood of the crowd was visibly tense. But no one was being trampled underfoot. Yet. Looking further along the street, I could make out a slow, steady flow of people north, away from the heart of the city. I'd been half expecting something deadly and silent. Ingenuity were bioengineers, after all, but I should have known better. A rain of explosions, buildings reduced to dust, and a stream of refugees made far better pictures for Anarchy Comes to Stateless. The mercenaries weren't here to take control of the island with clinical efficiency. They were here to prove that all renegade societies were doomed to collapse into telegenic mayhem. A shell went off somewhere east of the hotel, the closest yet. White powder rained down from the ceiling. One corner of the polymer window popped loose from its frame and curled up like a dead leaf. I squatted on the floor, covering my head, cursing myself for not leaving with De Groot and Mosala, and cursing Achille for ignoring my messages. Why couldn't I accept the fact that I meant nothing to Ver? I'd been of some use. Here we go. I'd been of some use in the struggle to protect Mosala from the heretic ACs, and I'd brought Ver the news which supposedly revealed the truth behind distress, but now that the great information plague was coming, I was irrelevant. The door swung open. An elderly Fijian woman stepped into the room. The hotel staff wore no uniforms, but I thought I'd seen her before, working in the building. She announced curtly, "We're evacuating the city. Take what you can carry." The floor had stopped moving, but I rose to my feet unsteadily, unsure I'd heard her correctly. I'd already packed my clothes. I grabbed my suitcase and followed her out into the corridor. My room was just past the stairs, and she was heading for the next door along. I gestured at the other half of the corridor, some 20 rooms. "Have you checked?" "No." For a moment she seemed reluctant to entrust me with the task, but then she relented. She held up her passkey and let my notepad clone its IR signature. I left my suitcase by the stairs. The first 4 rooms were empty. More shells were exploding all the time now, most of them mercifully distant. I kept one eye on the screen as I waved my notepad at the locks. Someone was collating all the damage reports and posting an annotated map of the city. So far, 21 buildings had been demolished, mainly apartment blocks. There was no question that if strategic targets had been chosen, they would have been hit. Maybe the most valuable infrastructure was being spared, saved for the use of a puppet government to be installed by a second wave of invaders who'd rescue the island from anarchy? Or maybe the aim was simply to level as many residential buildings as possible in order to drive the greatest number of people out into the desert. I found Lowell Parker, the Atlantica journalist I'd seen at Mosala's media conference, crouched on the floor, shaking, much as the woman from the hotel had found me. He recovered quickly and seemed to accept the news of the evacuation gratefully, as if all he'd been waiting for was word of a definite plan, even if it came from someone else who didn't have a clue. In the next 10 or 12 rooms, I came across 4 more people. Journalists or academics, probably, but no one I recognized, most of them already packed, just waiting to be told what to do. No one stopped to question the wisdom of the message I was passing on, and I badly wanted to get away from the bombing myself, but the prospect of 1 million people pouring out of the city was beginning to fill me with dread. The greatest disasters of the last 50 years had all been among refugees fleeing war zones. Maybe it would be smarter to take my chances playing Russian roulette with the shells. I knew the last room was a suite, the mirror image of Mosala and de Groot's. The architectural symmetry of the building demanded it. The cloned passkey signature unlocked the door, but there was a chain keeping it from opening any more than a crack. I called out loudly. No one answered. I tried using my shoulder, and bruised myself, badly, to no effect. Swearing, I kicked the door near the chain, which was twice as painful, almost splitting my stitches, but it worked. Henry Buzzo was sprawled on the floor beneath the window, flat on his back. I approached, dismayed, doubting that there'd be much chance of getting help amid all the chaos. He was wearing a red velvet bathrobe, and his hair was wet, as if he'd just stepped out of the shower. A bioweapon from the extremists finally taking hold? Or just a heart attack from the shock of the explosions? Neither. The bathrobe was soaked with blood. A hole had been blasted in his chest. Not by a sniper. The window was intact. I squatted down and pressed 2 fingers against his carotid artery. He was dead, but still warm. I closed my eyes and clenched my teeth, trying not to scream with frustration. After all it had taken to get Mosala off the island, Buzzo could have saved himself so easily. A few words admitting the flaw in his work, and he'd still be alive. It wasn't pride that had killed him, though. Screw that. He'd had a right to his stubbornness, a right to defend his theory, flawed or not. He was dead for precisely one reason. Some psychotic AC had sacrificed him to the mirage of transcendence. I found 2 U-Mail security guards in the second bedroom, one fully dressed, one had probably been sleeping. Both looked like they'd been shot in the face. I was in shock now, more dazed than sickened, but I finally had enough presence of mind to start filming. Maybe there'd be a trial, eventually, and if the hotel was about to be reduced to rubble, there'd be no other evidence. I surveyed the bodies in close-up, then walked from room to room, sweeping the camera around indiscriminately, hoping to capture enough detail for a complete reconstruction. The bathroom door was locked. I felt an idiotic surge of hope. Maybe a 4th person had witnessed the crime, but had managed to hide here in safety. I rattled the handle, and I was on the verge of yelling out words of reassurance when the meaning of the chained front door finally penetrated my stupor. I stood frozen for several seconds, at first not quite believing it, and then afraid to move. Because I could hear someone breathing. Soft and shallow, but not soft enough. Struggling for control. Centimeters away. I couldn't let go of the handle. My fingers were clenched tight. I placed my left hand flat against the cool surface of the door, at the height where the killer's face would be, hoping to sense the contours, to gauge the distance from skin to skin by the resonant pitch of every screaming nerve end. Who was it? Who was the extremist's assassin? Who had had the opportunity to infect me with the engineered cholera? Some stranger I'd passed in the Phnom Penh transit lounge, or the crowded bazaar of Dili Airport? The Polynesian businessman who'd sat beside me on the last leg of the flight? Indrani Lee? I was shaking with horror, certain that a bullet would pierce my skull in a matter of seconds, but part of me still wanted, badly, to break open the door and see. I could have broadcast the moment live on the net and gone out in a blaze of revelation. Another shell exploded nearby, the shockwave resonating through the building so powerfully that the frame almost flexed itself free of the lock. I turned and fled. The procession out of the city was an ordeal, but perhaps never more than it had to be. From my snail's eye view of the crowd, everyone looked as terrified, as claustrophobic, as desperate for momentum as I was, but they remained stubbornly, defiantly patient, inching forward like novice tightrope walkers, calculating every movement, sweating from the tension between fear and restraint. Children wailed in the distance, but the adults around me spoke in guarded whispers between the ground-shaking detonations. I kept waiting for an apartment block to collapse in front of us, burying 100 people and crushing 100 more in the panic of retreat. But it failed to happen, again and again, and after 20 excruciating minutes we'd left the shelling behind. The procession kept moving. For a long time we remained jammed in a herd, shoulder to shoulder, with no choice but to keep step. But once we were out of the built-up suburbs and into the industrial areas, where the factories and warehouses were set in wide expanses of bare rock, there was suddenly space to move freely. As the opaque scrum around me melted into near transparency, I could see half a dozen quadcycles ahead in the distance, and even an electric truck keeping pace. By then, we'd been walking for almost 2 hours, but the sun was still low, and as the crowd spread out, a welcome cool breeze moved in between us. My spirits were lifting, slightly. Despite the scale of the exodus, I'd witnessed no real violence. The worst I'd seen so far was an enraged couple screaming accusations of infidelity at each other as they trudged along, side by side, each holding up one end of a bundle of possessions wrapped in orange tent fabric. It was clear that the whole evacuation had been rehearsed, or at least widely discussed in great detail, long before the invasion. Civil Defense Plan D, head for the coast. And a planned evacuation, with tents, with blankets, with solar rechargeable stoves, didn't have to be the disaster here that it might have been almost anywhere else. We were moving closer to the reefs and the ocean farms, the source of all the island's food. The freshwater arteries in the rock could be tapped with relative ease, as could the sewage treatment conduits. If exposure, starvation, dehydration, and disease were the greatest killers of modern warfare, the people of Stateless seemed to be uniquely equipped to resist them all. The only thing that worried me was the certainty that the mercenaries understood all of this perfectly. If their aim with the shelling had been to drive us out of the city, they must have known how relatively little misery it would cause. Maybe they believed that selective footage of the Exodus would still be enough to confirm the political failure of Stateless in most people's eyes, and with or without scenes of dysentery and starvation, there was no doubt that the position of the anti-boycott nations had already been weakened. I had a queasy suspicion, though, that merely evicting 1 million people into tent villages wouldn't be enough for ingenuity. Remind me to have a brief discussion at some point about what the future of our real world holds vis-a-vis mass migration of people away from areas affected by climate change. See Exhibit A, Syria, and much of Africa, but on a scale including, say, the Maldives and whatnot. Mainly a discussion on what will the people, the territories that they flee to, in order to survive, what will they do about the mass influx, whatever the opposite of an exodus is. of people. I'm not going to have that discussion right now. It's grim. It's grim. I have suspicions. I'd transmitted the footage from Buzzo's suite, along with a brief deposition putting it in context, to the FBI and to the security firm's head office in Suva. It had seemed the proper way to let the families of the three men hear of their deaths, and to set in motion as much of an investigation as was possible under the circumstances. I hadn't sent a copy to CNET, less out of respect for the bereaved relatives than out of a reluctance to choose between admitting to Lydia that I'd concealed the facts about Mosala and the ACs, and compounding the crime by pretending that I had no idea why Buzzo had been assassinated. Whatever I did, I was probably screwed in the long run, but I wanted to delay the inevitable for a few more days, if possible. Some 3 hours' slow march from the city. Something about that didn't sound right. Some 3 hours' slow march from the city, I caught sight of a multicolored blur in the distance, which soon resolved itself into a vast patchwork of vivid green and orange squares, scattered across the rock a few kilometers ahead. We'd just left the central plateau behind, and the ground now sloped gently down all the way to the coast. Whether it was that modest gradient or the end of the march coming into view, the going suddenly seemed to get easy. The going seemed suddenly easier. 30 minutes later, the people around me stopped and began to pitch their own tents. I sat on my suitcase and rested for a while, then dutifully commenced recording. Whether the evacuation had been rehearsed or not, the island itself collaborated with the refugees so fully as they set up camp that the process looked more like a smooth slotting into place of missing components in an elaborate machine, the logical completion of a function the bare rock had always implied, than any kind of desperate attempt to improvise in an emergency. One tear-sized droplet of signaling peptide was enough to start the cascade which instructed the lithophiles to open a shaft to a buried freshwater artery, and by the time I'd seen the third pump installed, I'd learned to recognize the characteristic swirl of green and blue trace minerals which marked the sites where wells could be formed. Sewerage took a little longer. The shafts were wider and deeper, and the access points rarer. This was the flip side of Ned Lander's mad, tire-eating survivalist nightmare, autonomy through biotech, but without the extremism and paranoia. I only hoped that the founders and designers of Stateless, the Californian anarchists who'd worked for Ingenuity all those decades ago, were still alive to see how well their invention was serving its purpose. By noon, with royal blue marquees providing shade for the water pumps, bright red tents erected over the latrines, and even a rudimentary first aid center, I believed I understood what the medic had meant when she'd warned me not to think that I knew better than the locals. I checked the damage map of the city. It was no longer being updated, but at the last recorded count, over 200 buildings, including the hotel, had been leveled. Maybe Technoliberation could never transform the unforgiving rock of the continents into anything as hospitable as Stateless, but in a world accustomed to images of squalid refugee camps choking on dust or drowning in mud, maybe the contrasting vision of the Renegade's village could still symbolize the benefits of an end to the gene patent laws, more persuasively than the island at peace ever had. I recorded everything and dispatched the footage to CNET's newsroom, with narration which I hoped would limit the perverse downside. The less dramatic the anarchists' plight, the less chance there was of any grassroots political backlash against the invasion. I didn't want to see Stateless discredited, with commentators tutting wisely that it had always been destined to slide into the abyss. But when it took 1,000 corpses a day to raise a flicker of interest from the average viewer, if I painted too sanguine a picture, the exodus would be a non-story. The first truck from the coast which I sighted ran out of food. Yes. The first truck from the coast which I sighted ran out of food long before it came near us. By 3 p.m., though, with the sixth delivery, 2 market tents had been set. Why am I struggling with that? By 3 p.m., though, with the sixth delivery, 2 market tents had been set up near one of the water pumps. and an ad hoc restaurant was under construction. 40 minutes later, I sat on a folding chair in the shade of a photovoltaic awning, with a bowl of steaming sea urchin stew on my lap. There were a dozen other people eating out, forced to flee without their own cooking equipment. They eyed my camera suspiciously, but admitted that, of course, there'd been plans for leaving the city, first drafted long ago, but discussed and refined every year. I felt more optimistic than ever, and more out of sync with the mood of the locals. They seemed to be taking the success of the Exodus, a small miracle in my eyes, for granted. But now that they'd come through it unscathed, as they'd always expected, and were waiting for the mercenaries to make the next move, everything had become less certain. "What do you think will happen in the next 24 hours?" I asked one woman with a small boy on her lap. She wrapped her arms around the child protectively and said nothing. Outside, someone roared with pain. The restaurant emptied in seconds. I managed to penetrate the crowd which had formed in the narrow square between the markets and the restaurant, and then found myself forced back as they drew away in panic. A young Fijian man had been lofted meters above the ground by invisible machinery. He was wide-eyed with terror, crying out for help. He was struggling pitifully, but his arms hung at his sides, bloody and ruined, white bone protruding through the flesh of one elbow. The thing which had taken him was too strong to be fought. People were wailing and shouting, and trying to force their way out of the crowd. I resisted too long, transfixed with horror, and I was shoved to my knees. I covered my head and crouched down, but I was still an obstacle to the stampede. Someone heavy tripped on me, jabbing me with knees and elbows, then leaning on me to regain his balance, almost crushing my spine. I cowered on the ground as the buffeting continued, wishing I could rise to my feet, but certain that any attempt would only see me knocked flat on my back and trampled in the face. The man's desperate pleading was like a second rain of blows. I tucked my head deeper into my arms, trying to blot out the sound. Somewhere nearby, a tent wall collapsed gently to the ground. Long seconds passed, and no one else collided with me. I raised my head. The square was deserted. The man was still alive, but his eyes were rolling up into his skull intermittently, his jaw working feebly. Both his legs had been shattered now. Blood trickled down onto his invisible torturer, each droplet halting in mid-fall and spreading out for a moment, hinting at a tangible surface before vanishing into the hidden carapace. I searched the ground for my camera, emitting soft, angry, choking noises. My throat was knotted, my chest constricted. Every breath, every movement felt like a punishment. I found the camera and attached it, then rose shakily to my feet and began recording. The man stared at me in disbelief. He looked me in the eye and said, "Help me!" I stretched a hand in his direction, impotently. The insect ignored me, and I knew I was in no danger. It wanted this to be seen. But I was giddy with rage and frustration, sweating cold, stinking rivulets down my face and chest. A delicate sheen of interference fringes raced over the robot's form as it raised the man higher. The camera followed my gaze upward until I knew it was framing only the broken body and the uncaring sky. I heard myself bellowing, "Where's the fucking militia now? Where are your weapons? Where are your bombs? Do something!" The man's head lolled. I hoped he'd lost consciousness. Invisible pincers snapped his spine, then flung him aside. I heard the corpse thud against the marquee above the water pumps, then slide to the ground. The whole camp of 10,000 seemed to be wailing in my skull, and I was screaming incoherently, but I kept my eyes locked on the place where the robot had to be. There was a loud scrabbling sound from the space in front of me. A sickening hush descended in the alleys around the square. The insect played with the light, sketching its own outline for us, in reef rock gray against the heavens, in sky blue against the rock. The body, hanging from its 6 upturned V legs, was long and segmented, a blunt, restless head at each end swiveled curiously, sniffing the air. 4 lithe tentacles slithered in and out of sheaths in the carapace, tipped with sharp claws. I stood, swaying in the silence, waiting for something to happen, for someone with a jacket full of plastic explosives to burst out of an alley and run straight at the machine in the hope of a kamikaze embrace. Though V would not have come within 10 meters before being blasted back into the crowd to incinerate a dozen friends instead. The thing arched its body and raised a pair of limbs, spreading them wide in a gesture of triumph. Then it lurched toward a gap between the tents, sending people tripping into the walls and frantically clawing at the fabric, trying to tear a way out of its path. It raced down the alley and disappeared, heading south, back toward the city. Sorry about that. Had a sneezing fit. Very strange. Huddled on the ground behind the latrines, not ready to face the demoralized people of the camp, I dispatched the footage of the murder to CNET. I tried to compose some narration to go with it, but I was still in shock. I couldn't concentrate. I thought, war correspondents see much worse day after day. How long will it be before I'm inured to this? I scanned the international coverage. Everyone was still talking about rival anarchists, including CNET, who'd broadcast nothing I'd sent them. I spent 5 minutes trying to calm myself, then called Lydia. It took me half an hour to get through to her in person. All I could hear around me was people sobbing with grief. What would it be like after the 10th attack, the 100th? I closed my eyes and fantasized about Cape Town, Sydney, Manchester, anywhere. When Lydia answered, I said, "I'm here, I'm covering this, so what's happening to my footage?" She was not in charge of news, but she was the only person likely to give me a straight answer. But Lydia was stony-faced, cold with anger. "Your obituary of Violet Mosala had a whole scene cooked up out of thin air, and it said nothing about the cult which killed Yasuko Nishide, and now Henry Buzzo. I've seen your deposition to the security firm, about the cholera, about the fishing boat. So what are you playing at?" I clutched at excuses, trying to find the right ones, knowing that Mosala would have died if I hadn't used you was not good enough. I said, "Everything I faked she really said, off the record. Ask her." Lydia was unmoved. "It's still unacceptable. It still violates all the guidelines, and we can't ask her anything. She's comatose." I didn't want to hear that. If Mosala was brain damaged, it had all been for nothing. I said, "I couldn't tell you the rest, because I couldn't tip off the anthrocosmologists by broadcasting everything." I was ranting. The ACs had already known exactly how much I would have told the authorities. Lydia's expression softened, as if I was clearly so far gone now that I deserved to be pitied, not rebuked. "Look, I hope you find a way to get home safely, but the documentary's cancelled. You've broken the terms of the contract, and news isn't interested in your coverage of the political problems on the island." Political problems? I'm in the middle of a war being funded by the biggest biotech company on the planet. I'm the only journalist on the island who seems to have a clue what's going on. And I'm CNET's only journalist, period. So how can they not be interested? "We're negotiating coverage from someone else." "Yeah? Who? Janet Walsh?" "It's none of your business." "I don't believe you. Ingenuity are slaughtering people and—" Lydia held up a hand to silence me. I don't want to hear any more of your propaganda, okay? I'm sorry you've been through so much unpleasantness. I'm sorry the anarchists are killing each other. She spoke with genuine sadness, I think. But if you've taken sides, and you want to churn out polemics against the boycott and the patent laws full of forged material, then that's your problem. I can't help you. Be careful, Andrew. Goodbye. As dusk... As dusk fell, I wandered through the camp, filming, transmitting the signal in real time to my console at home, guaranteeing a record of everything for what it was worth. The model refugee village was still intact, the pumps still working, the sanitation impeccable. Lights shone everywhere, haloed with orange and green through the fabric, and the aroma of cooking wafted out of every second doorway. The tent's stored photovoltaic electricity would last for hours yet. No great damage had been done, no source of physical comfort had been lost. But the people I passed were tense, fearful, silent. The robot could return at any time, day or night, and kill one more person, or 1,000. By sending the robots out of the city to strike at random, the mercenaries could rapidly undermine morale, and drive people even further away, closer to the coast. Greenhouse refugees forced to cling to the shoreline, waiting for the next big storm, the fate they'd come to Stateless to avoid, might be ready to abandon the island altogether. I couldn't imagine what had happened to the so-called militia. Maybe they'd all been slaughtered already, in some brave, idiotic stand back in the city. I scanned the local nets. There were bleak reports of dozens of attacks like the one I'd witnessed, but little else. I didn't expect the anarchists to broadcast all their military secrets on the nets, but I found the absence of blustering propaganda, of morale-boosting claims of imminent victory, strangely chilling. Maybe the silence meant something, but if it did, I couldn't decipher it. It was growing cold. I was reluctant to ask for shelter in a stranger's tent. I wasn't afraid of being turned away, but I still felt too much like an outsider, despite all my feeble gestures of solidarity. These people were under siege, and they had no reason to trust me. So I sat in the restaurant, drinking hot, thin soup. The other customers talked among themselves, keeping their voices low, glancing at me more with measured caution than open hostility, but excluding me nonetheless. I'd destroyed my career, for Mosala, for Technoliberation, but I'd achieved nothing. Mosala was in a coma. Stateless was on the verge of a long and bloody decline. I felt numb, and paranoid, and useless. Then a message arrived from Akili. Veed escaped the city unharmed, and was in another camp, less than a kilometer away. Chapter 28. Sit down, anywhere that looks comfortable. The tent contained nothing but a backpack. Jeez. The tent contained nothing but a backpack and an unrolled sleeping bag. The transparent floor looked dry, despite the hint of dew outside, but almost thin enough for the grit beneath it to be felt through the plastic. I stumbled all over that. The tent contained nothing but a backpack and an unrolled sleeping bag. The transparent floor looked dry, despite the hint of dew outside, but almost thin enough for the grit beneath it to be felt through the plastic. A black patch on the wall radiated gentle heat, powered by the solar energy stored in the charge displacement polymers which were woven into every strand of the tent's fabric. I sat on one end of the sleeping bag. Achilles sat cross-legged beside me. I looked around appreciatively. However humble, it was a vast improvement on bare rock. "Where did you find this? I don't know if they shoot looters on Stateless, but I'd say it was worth the risk." Achilles snorted. "I didn't have to steal it. Where do you think I've been living for the past 2 weeks? We can't all afford the rates." We exchanged updates. Achilles had heard most of my news already, from other sources. Buzo's death, Mosala's evacuation, and uncertain condition. But not her joke on the ACs, the automatic dissemination of her TOE around the world. Achilles frowned intensely, silent for a long time. Something had changed in Viz's face since I'd seen her in the hospital. The deep shock of recognition at the news of the supposed mixing plague had given way to a kind of expectant gaze, as if V was prepared now to be taken by distress at any moment, and was almost eager to embrace the experience, despite the anguish and horror all its victims had displayed. Even the few who had been briefly calm and lucid in their own strange way had swiftly relapsed. If I'd believed that the syndrome was everyone's fate, I would not have wished to go on living. Achilles confessed, We still can't fit our models to the data. No one I've been in contact with can work out what's going on." V seemed resigned to the fact that the plague could elude precise analysis in the short term, but still confident that Viz's basic explanation was correct. "The new cases are appearing too rapidly, much faster than exponential growth." "Then maybe you're wrong about the mixing. You made a prediction of exponential growth, and now it's failed. So maybe you've been reading too much anthrocosmology into 3 sick people's ranting." V shook Viz's head, calmly dismissing the possibility. 17 people now. Your CNET colleague isn't the only one who's seen it. Other journalists have begun to report the same phenomenon, and there's a way to explain the discrepancy in the case numbers. "How?" "Multiple keystones." I laughed wearily. What's the collective noun for that? Not an arch of keystones, surely. A pantheon? One person with one theory explaining the universe into existence. Isn't that the whole premise of anthrocosmology? One theory, yes, and one person always seemed the most likely scenario. We always knew that the TOE would be broadcast to the world, but we always assumed that every last detail would be worked out in full by its discoverer first. But if the discoverer is lying in a coma when the complete TOE is dispatched to tens of thousands of people simultaneously, that's like nothing we ever contemplated. And nothing we can hope to model. The mathematics becomes intractable. V spread his hands in a gesture of acceptance. No matter. We'll all learn the truth soon enough. My skin crawled. In Achilles' presence, I didn't know what I believed. I said, "Learn it how? Mosala's TOE doesn't predict telepathy with the keystone, or keystones, any more than it predicts the universe unraveling. If she's right, you must be wrong." "It depends what she's right about." "Everything? As in theory of?" "Everything could unravel tonight, and most TOEs would have nothing to say about it one way or another. The rules of chess can't tell you whether or not the board is strong enough to hold up every legal configuration of the pieces." "But every TOE has plenty to say about the human brain, doesn't it? It's a lump of ordinary matter, subject to all the ordinary laws of physics. It doesn't start mixing with information just because someone completes a theory of everything on the other side of the planet." Achilles said, 2 days ago I would have agreed with you. But TOEs which fail to deal with their own basis in information are as incomplete as general relativity, which required the Big Bang to take place, but then broke down completely at that point. It took the unification of all 4 forces to smooth away the singularity, and it looks like it's going to take one more unification to understand the explanatory Big Bang. But 2 days ago? I was wrong. The mainstream always assumed that an incomplete TOE was just the way things had to be. The keystone would explain everything, except how a TOE could actually come into force. Anthrocosmology would answer that question, but that side of the equation would never be visible. Akili held out both hands, palms pressed together horizontally. Physics and metaphysics. We believed they'd remain separate forever. They always had in the past, so it seemed like a reasonable premise, like the single keystone. V interlocked Viz's fingers, and tipped Viz's hands to a 45-degree angle. It just happens to be wrong. Maybe because a TOE which unifies physics and information, which mixes the levels and describes its own authority, is the very opposite of unraveling. It's more stable than any other possibility. It affirms itself. It tightens the knot. I suddenly recalled the night I'd visited Amanda Conroy, when I'd concluded, tongue-in-cheek, that the separation of powers between Mosala and the anthrocosmologists was a good thing. And later, Henry Buzzo had jokingly postulated a theory which supported itself, defended itself, ruled out all competitors, refused to be swallowed. I said, but whose theory is going to unify physics and information? Mosala's TOE makes no attempt to describe its own authority. Akili saw no obstacle. She never intended it to, but either she failed to understand all the implications of her own work, or someone out on the net is going to get hold of her purely theoretical TOE and extend it to embrace information theory, in a matter of days, or hours. I stared at the ground, suddenly angry, all the mundane horrors of the day closing in on me. How can you sit here wrapped up in this bullshit? Whatever happened to technoliberation, solidarity with the renegades, smashing the boycott? My own meager skills and connections had already come to nothing in the face of the invasion, but somehow I'd imagined Akili proving to be 1,000 times more resourceful, taking a vital role at the hub of the resistance, orchestrating some brilliant counterattack. V said quietly, "What do you expect me to do? I'm not a soldier. I don't know how to win the war for Stateless. And there'll soon be more people with distress than there are on this whole island. If the ACs don't try to analyze the mixing plague, no one else is going to do it." I laughed bitterly. And now you're ready to believe that understanding everything drives us insane? The ignorance cults were right? The TOE sends us screaming and kicking into the abyss? Just when I'd made up my mind that there was no such thing. Akili shifted uncomfortably. I don't know why people are taking it so hard. Much better. For the first time, there was a hint of fear in Viz's voice, breaking through the determined acceptance. But mixing before the Aleph moment must be imperfect, distorted, because if it wasn't flawed in some way, the first victims of distress would have explained everything and become the keystone. I don't know what the flaw is, what's missing, what makes the partial understanding so traumatic, but once the TOE is completed... V trailed off. If the Aleph moment didn't put an end to distress, the misery of a war on Stateless would be nothing. If the TOE could not be faced, all that lay ahead was universal madness. We both fell silent. The camp was quiet, except for a few young children crying in the distance, and the faint clatter of cooking utensils in some nearby tents. Akili said, "Andrew?" "Yes?" "Look at me." I turned and faced Viz squarely, for the first time since I'd arrived. Viz's dark eyes appeared more luminous than ever, intelligent, searching, compassionate. The unself-conscious beauty of Viz's face evoked a deep, astonished resonance inside me, a thrill of recognition which reverberated from the darkness in my skull to the base of my spine. My whole body ached at the sight of Ver, every muscle fiber, every tendon. But it was welcome pain, as if I'd been beaten and left to die, and now found myself, impossibly, waking. That was what Akili was, my last hope, my resurrection. V said, "What is it you want?" "I don't know what you mean." "Come on, I'm not blind." V searched my face, frowning slightly, puzzled but unaccusing. "Have I done something? To lead you on? To give you the wrong idea?" "No." I wanted the ground to swallow me, and I wanted to touch Ver more than I wanted to live. Neural asexes can make people lose track of the messages they're sending. I thought I'd made everything clear, but if I've confused you... I cut Ver off. You did. Make everything. I heard my voice disintegrating. I waited a few seconds, forcing myself to breathe calmly, willing my throat to unknot, then said evenly, "It's not your fault. I'm sorry I've offended you. I'll go." I began to stand. "No." Akili placed a hand on my shoulder, gently restraining me. "You're my friend, and you're in pain, and we're going to work this out." V rose to Viz's feet, but then squatted down and began to unlace Viz's shoes. "What are you doing?" "Sometimes you think you know something, you think you've taken it in, but it's not real until you've seen it with your own eyes." V pulled Viz's loose t-shirt over Viz's head. Viz's torso was slender, lightly muscled. Viz's chest perfectly smooth. No breasts, no nipples, nothing. I looked away, and then climbed to my feet, determined to walk out. At that moment, prepared to abandon Ver for no better reason than to preserve a desire which I'd always known led nowhere. But then I stood there paralyzed, light-headed, vertiginous. I said numbly, "You don't have to do this." Akili walked up to me, stood beside me. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. V took my right hand and placed it against Viz's stomach, which was flat and soft and hairless, then forced my sweating fingers down between Viz's legs. There was nothing but smooth skin, cool and dry all the way, and then a tiny urethral opening. I pulled free, burning with humiliation, swallowing a venomous barb about African traditions just in time. I retreated as far as the tent allowed, still refusing to face Ver, and a wave of grief and anger swept over me. "Why? How could you hate your body so much?" "I never hated it, but I never worshipped it either." V spoke softly, striving for patience, but weary of the need to justify herself. I didn't pick you for an Edenite. The ignorance cults all worship the smallest cages they can find, the accidents of birth, of biology, of history and culture, and then rail against anyone who dares to show them the bars of a cage 10 billion times larger. But my body is not a temple, or a dung heap. Those are the choices of idiot mythology, not the choices of techno-liberation. The deepest truth about my body is that all that restrains it, in the end, is physics. We can reshape it into anything the TOE allows. This cool logic only made me recoil even more. I agreed with every word of it, but I clung to my instinctive horror like a lifeline. The deepest truth would still have been true if you hadn't sacrificed... I've sacrificed nothing, except some ancient hardwired behavioral patterns buried in my limbic system, triggered by certain visual cues and pheromones, and the need to have small explosions of endogenous opiates go off in my brain. I turned and let myself look at Ver. V stared back at me defiantly. The surgery had been well executed. V did not look unbalanced, deformed. I had no right to grieve for a loss which existed only in my head. Nobody had mutilated Ver by force. V had made Viz's own decision with Viz's eyes wide open. I had no right to wish Ver healed. I was still shaken and angry, though. I still wanted to punish Ver for what V'd taken from me. I asked sardonically, "And where does that get you? Does hacking out your base animal instincts grant you some great, rarefied insight? Don't tell me you can tune in to the lost wisdom of the celibate medieval saints." Akili grimaced, amused. "Hardly. But sex grants no insight either, any more than shooting up heroin does, however much the cultists rant about tantric mysteries and the communion of souls. Give an MR a magic mushroom or two, and they'll tell you sincerely that they've just fucked God. Because sex, drugs, and religion all hinge on the same kind of simple neurochemical events, addictive, euphoric, exhilarating, and all equally meaningless." I'm not laughing at the scene. Jay Waldrop says, "I'm rather partial to my endogenous opiates myself." Hear, hear. Oh no, it's all falling down. Don't worry, we'll get around to reading some of Ian M. Banks's culture novels this year, I promise. We can enjoy those and then some. Where were we? Yes, here we go. Give an MR a magic mushroom or two, and they'll tell you sincerely that they've just fucked God. Because sex, drugs, and religion all hinge on the same kind of simple neurochemical events. Addictive, euphoric, exhilarating, and all equally meaningless. It was a familiar truth, but at that moment it cut deep. Because I still wanted her, and the drug I was hooked on did not exist. Achille half raised Viz's hands as if to offer a truce. Vid had no wish to hurt me, only to defend Viz's own philosophy. If most people choose to remain addicted to orgasm, then that's their right. Not even the most radical asexuals would dream of forcing anyone to follow us. But I don't happen to want my own life to revolve around a few cheap biochemical tricks. Not even to be made in the image of your beloved Keystone? You still don't get it, do you? V laughed wearily. The Keystone is not some teleological endpoint, some cosmic ideal. In 1,000 years' time, the Keystone's body will be the same obsolete joke as yours and mine. I'd run out of anger. I said simply, I don't care. Sex can still be much more than the release of endogenous opiates. Of course it can. It can be a form of communication. But it can also be the very opposite, with all the same biology in play. And all I've given up is that which the best and worst sex have in common. Don't you see that? All I've done is subtracted out the noise. These words made no sense to me. I looked away, defeated. And I knew that the pain I'd thought of as an ache of longing had never been more than the bruising I'd received from the crowd as they fled the robot, and the throbbing of the wound in my stomach, and the weight of failure. I said, without hope, but don't you ever want some kind of physical solace? Some kind of contact? Don't you ever still just want to be touched? I was speechless. Achille walked toward me and said gently, Yes, that's what I've been trying to tell you. I was speechless. V placed one hand on my shoulder and cupped the other against my face, raising my eyes to meet Viz. If it's what you want too, if it won't be frustrating, if it's what you want too, if it won't just be frustrating for you, and if you understand, this can't turn into any kind of sex. I said, I understand. I undressed quickly, before I could change my mind, trembling like a nervous adolescent, willing my erection to vanish, without success. Achille turned up the heating panel, and we lay on our sides on the sleeping bag, eyes locked, not quite touching. I reached over and tentatively stroked Viz's shoulder, the side of Viz's neck, Viz's back. Do you like that? Yes. I hesitated. Can I kiss you? Not a good idea, I think. Just relax. V brushed my cheek with Viz's cool fingers, then ran the back of Viz's hand down the center of my chest, toward my bandaged abdomen. I was shivering. Does your leg still hurt? Sometimes. Relax. V kneaded my shoulders. Have you ever done this with a non-asex before? Yes. Male or female? Female. Achille laughed softly. You should see your face. Look, if you come, it's not the end of the world. She did, so I'm not going to throw you out in disgust. V slid a hand over my hip. It might be better if you did. You might loosen up. I shuddered at Viz's touch, but my erection was slowly subsiding. I stroked the smooth, unmarked skin where a nipple might have been, searching for scar tissue with my fingertips, finding nothing. Achille stretched lazily. I began massaging the side of Viz's neck again. I said, I'm lost. I don't know what we're doing. I don't know where we're heading. Nowhere. We can stop if you want to. We can always just talk. Or we can talk without stopping. It's called freedom. You'll get used to it eventually. This is very strange. Our eyes remained locked together, and Achille seemed happy enough, but I still felt I should have been hunting for some way to make everything 1,000 times more intense. I said, I know why this feels wrong. Physical pleasure without sex. I hesitated. Go on. Physical pleasure without sex is generally classified as... What? You're not gonna like this. V thumped me in the ribs. Spit it out. Infantile. Achille sighed. Okay, exorcism time. Repeat after me. Uncle Sigmund, I renounce you as a charlatan, a bully, and a fabricator of data. A corrupter of language, a destroyer of lives. Abso-fucking-lutely, by the way. Oh, God, he set that whole profession back generations, possibly centuries. I complied. Then I wrapped my arms around Ver tightly, and we lay there with our legs entwined, heads on each other's shoulders, gently stroking each other's backs. The whole futile sexual charge I'd felt since the fishing boat was finally lifting. All the pleasure came from the warmth of Viz's body, the unfamiliar contours of Viz's flesh, the texture of Viz's skin, the sense of Viz's presence. And I still found Ver as beautiful as ever. I still cared about Ver as much as ever. Was this what I'd always been looking for? Asexual love? It was a disquieting notion, but I thought it through calmly. Maybe all my life I'd unconsciously swallowed the Edenite lie, that everything in the perfect, harmonious, modern emotional relationship somehow flowed magically out of beneficent nature. Monogamy, equality, honesty, respect, tenderness, selflessness. It was all pure instinct, pure sexual biology, taking its unfettered course, despite the fact that all those criteria of perfection had changed radically from century to century, from culture to culture. The Edenites proclaimed that anyone who fell short of the glowing ideal was either willfully fighting Mother Gaia, or had been corrupted by a traumatic upbringing, media manipulation, or the deeply unnatural power structures of modern society. In fact, the ancient reproductive drives had been hemmed in by civilizing forces, inhibited by cultural strictures, and pressed into service to create social cohesion in countless different ways. But they hadn't actually changed in tens of thousands of years, and they contradicted current mores, or were silent just as often as they supported them. Gina's unfaithfulness had hardly been a crime against biology, and whatever I'd done to drive her away had been a failure of purely conscious effort, a lack of attentiveness that any Stone Age ancestor would have found second nature. Virtually everything which modern humans valued in relationships, over and above the act of sex itself and some degree of protectiveness toward their partners and offspring, arose by a separate force of will. There was a massive shell of moral and social constructs wrapped around the tiny core of instinctive behavior, and the pearl bore little resemblance to the grit. I had no wish to abandon either, but if what I'd failed at so badly again and again had been reconciling the two, if the choice came down to biology or civilization, I knew now which I valued most. And asex could still be close. Asex could still touch. After a while, we climbed into the sleeping bag to keep warm. I was still numb with despair at the tragedy of Stateless, Mosala's senseless half-murder, the ruins of my career. But Achille kissed me on the forehead and tried his best to unknot my aching back and shoulders, and I did the same for Ver, in the hope that it might make Viz's fear of the great information plague, which I still did not believe was coming, in some small way, easier to bear. I woke, confused, to the sound of Achille breathing beside me. The tent was bathed in gray and blue light, shadowless as noon. I looked up and saw the disk of the moon overhead, a white spotlight penetrating the weave of the roof, rainbow-fringed by diffraction. I thought, Achille met me outside the airport. V could have infected me with the engineered cholera then, knowing that I'd carried it to Mosala. And when the weapon misfired, V'd produced the antidote, to gain my trust, in the hope that V could use me a second time. But then the moderates had unwittingly kidnapped us both, and there'd be no need to strike at Mosala again. It was sheer paranoia. I closed my eyes. Why would an extremist pretend to believe in the information plague? And if the belief was genuine, why kill Buzzo when the Aleph moment had been proved inevitable? Either way, with Mosala back in Cape Town, and her work proceeding, with or without her, what use could I be to the extremists? I disentangled myself and climbed out of the sleeping bag. Achille woke while I was dressing, and muttered sleepily, "The latrine tent glows red. You can't miss it." "I won't be long." I walked aimlessly, trying to clear my head. It was earlier than I'd imagined, barely after 9, but shockingly cold. Lights still showed from most of the tents, but the alleys between them were deserted. Achille as an extremist assassin made no sense. Why would V have struggled to get us off the fishing boat? But the doubt I'd felt on waking still cast a shadow over everything, as if my mistrust itself was as much of a disaster as any possibility that I could be right. How could we have been through so much together, only for me to wake beside her, wondering if it had all been a lie? I reached the southern edge of the camp. These people must have been the last wave of refugees to head north, because there was nothing in sight but bare reef rock stretching to the horizon. I hesitated and almost turned back. But pacing the alleys made me feel like a spy, and I wasn't ready to return to Achilles' tent, to the warmth of V's body, to the hope V seemed to offer. Half an hour before, I'd seriously considered migrating to total asex, tearing out my genitals and several vital pieces of gray matter as the panacea for all my woes. I needed to take a long walk, alone. I headed out into the moonlit desert. Whorls of trace minerals glittered everywhere. Now that I'd seen a few of these hieroglyphics deciphered, the ground appeared transformed, dense with meaning, although for all I knew, most of the patterns could still have been nothing but random decoration. The abandoned city was either in darkness or hidden from view by the slope of the ground. I could see no hint of light on the southern horizon. I pictured a fresh swarm of the invisible insects scurrying out from their nest at the center, but I knew that I'd be no safer back in camp, and the things only killed for the spectacle of it, for the panic they instilled. Alone, I was less of a target than ever. I thought I felt the ground shudder, a tremor so slight that I doubted it immediately. Was there still shelling going on? I'd imagined everyone leaving the city to the mercenaries. Yes, I read that correctly. I'd imagined everyone leaving the city to the mercenaries, but maybe a few dissenters had ignored the evacuation plan. Or maybe the militia had remained, in hiding, and the real confrontation had finally begun. That was a dismal prospect. They didn't stand a chance. It happened again. I couldn't judge the direction of the blast. I'd heard no sound at all, just felt the vibration. I turned a full circle, scanning the horizon for smoke. Maybe they were shelling the camps now. The white plumes over the city in the morning had been visible for kilometers, but shells meant for tents on bare rock would carry different charges, with different effects. I kept walking south, hoping that the city would come into view, along with some sign that the pyrotechnic action was still confined there. And I tried to imagine myself living through the war, emerging unscathed but cozily familiar with all the myriad technologies of death, but cozily familiar with all the myriad technologies of death, offering, to the nets who didn't care what I'd faked, footage complete with my own now expert commentary on the characteristic sound of a Chinese-made vigilance missile meeting its target, or the unmistakable visual signature of a Peace-Tech 40mm shell exploding over open ground. I felt a wave of resignation sweep over me. I'd swallowed too many dreams in the last 3 days. Techno-liberation, an end to the gene patent laws, personal happiness, asexual bliss. It was time to wake up. The ordinary madness of the world had finally reached Stateless, so why not stand back, regain some perspective, and try to scrape some kind of a living out of it? The invasion was no greater tragedy than 10,000 other bloody conquests before it, and it had always been inevitable. War had come, one way or another, to every known human culture. I whispered aloud, without much conviction, "Screw every known human culture." The ground roared and threw me. The reef rock was soft, but I hit it face down, bloodying my nose, maybe breaking it. Winded and astonished, I raised myself onto my hands and knees, but the ground still hadn't stopped shaking. I didn't trust myself to stand. I looked around for some evidence of a nearby impact, but there was no glow, no smoke, no crater, nothing. Was this the new terror, after invisible robots, invisible bombs? I knelt, waited, then climbed to my feet unsteadily. The reef rock was still reverberating. I paced in a drunken circle, searching the horizon, still refusing to believe that there could be no other sign of the blast. The air had been silent, though. It was the rock which had carried the noise. An underground detonation? Or undersea, beneath the island? And no detonation at all. The ground convulsed again. I landed badly, twisting one arm, but panic washed out everything, dulling the pain into insignificance. I clawed at the ground, trying to find the strength to deny every instinct which screamed at me to stay down, not to risk moving, when I knew that if I didn't stand, and then sprint faster across the shuddering dead coral than I'd ever moved in my life, I was lost. The mercenaries had killed off the lithophiles which gave the reef rock its buoyancy. That was why they'd driven us out of the city. Only the center of the island would hold. Beyond the support of the Guillot, the overhang was sinking. I turned to try to see what had happened to the camp. Blue and orange squares gazed back at me blankly. Most of the tents were still standing. I could see no one moving out across the... I could see no one... I could see no one moving out across the desert yet. It was too soon, but there was no question of going back to warn them. Not even Achille. Inland divers would surely understand what was happening faster than I had. There was nothing I could do now but try to save myself. I climbed to my feet and broke into a run. I covered about 10 meters before the ground shifted, slamming me down. I got up, took 3 steps, twisted an ankle, fell again. There was a constant, tortured cracking sound filling my head now, conducted through my body from reef rock to bone, resonating from living mineral to living mineral, the underworld reaching up to me, sharing its disintegration. I started crawling forward on my hands and knees, screaming wordlessly, almost paralyzed by a vision of the ocean rushing over the sinking reefs, sweeping up bodies, propelling them inland, dashing them against the splintering ground. I glanced back and saw nothing but the placid tent village, still uselessly intact. But the whole island was roaring in my skull. The deluge could only be minutes away. I stood again, ran for whole seconds despite the swaying stars, then landed heavily, splitting my stitches. Warm blood soaked the bandages. I rested, covering my ears, daring to wonder for the first time if it would be better to stop and wait to die. How far was I from the Guillot? How far would the ocean reach in, even if I made it to solid ground? I groped at my notepad pocket, as if I could get a GPS fix, check a few maps, come to some kind of decision. I rolled onto my back and started laughing. The stars jittered into time-lapse trails. I stood up, glanced over my shoulder, and saw someone running across the rock behind me. I dropped to my hands and knees, half voluntarily, but kept my eyes on the figure. V was dark-skinned and slender, but it wasn't Akili, the hair was too long. I strained my eyes. It was a teenage girl. Her face caught the moonlight, her eyes wide with fear, but her mouth set in determination. Then the ground heaved, and we both fell. I heard her cry out in pain. I waited, but she didn't get up. I started crawling back toward her. If she was injured, all I'd be able to do was sit with her until the ocean took us both, but I couldn't keep going and leave her. When I reached her, she was lying on her side with her legs jackknifed, massaging one calf, muttering angrily. I crouched beside her and shouted, "Do you think you can stand?" She shook her head. "We'd better sit it out here. We'll be safe here." I stared at her. "Don't you know what's happening? They've killed the lithophiles." "No, they've been reprogrammed. They're actively swallowing gas. Just killing them would be too slow, give too much warning." This was surreal. I couldn't focus on her. The ground was juddering too hard. "We can't stay here. Don't you understand? We'll drown." She shook her head again. For an instant, contradictory blurs of motion cancelled. She was smiling up at me as if I was a child afraid of a thunderstorm. "Don't worry, we'll be fine." What did she think would happen when the ocean came screaming in? We'd just hold each other up? 1,000,000 drowning refugees would all link hands and tread water together? Stateless had driven its children insane. A fine, moist spray rained down on us. I crouched and covered my head, picturing deep water rushing into the depressurized rock, blasting fissures all the way to the surface. And when I looked up, there it was. In the distance, a geyser fountained straight into the sky, a terrible silver thread in the moonlight. It was some 100 meters away, to the south, meaning that the path to the Guyot was already undermined, and there was no hope of escape. I lay down heavily beside the girl. She shouted at me, "Why were you running in the wrong direction? Did you lose your way?" I reached over and gripped her shoulder, hoping to see her face more clearly. We gazed at each other in mutual incomprehension. She yelled, "I was on scout duty. I should have stopped you at the edge of the camp, but I thought you'd just go a little away. I thought you just wanted a better view for your camera." The shoulder camera was still packed in my wallet. I hadn't even thought of using it, turning it back on the camp as it was flooded, broadcasting the genocide to the world. The gentle rain grew heavier for a second or two, but then subsided. I looked south and caught sight of the geyser collapsing. Then, for the first time, I noticed my hands trembling. The ground had quietened. Meaning what? The stretch of rock we lay on had broken free of its surroundings, like an iceberg, birthed screaming from a glacial sheet, and was floating in relative tranquility now, before the water rushed in around the edges. My ears rang, my body was quivering, but I glanced up at the sky, and the stars were rock steady, or vice versa. And then the girl gave me a shaken, queasy, adrenaline-drunk grin, her eyes shining with tears of relief. She believed that the ordeal was over, and I'd been warned not to think I knew better. I stared back at her wonderingly, my heart still pounding with terror, my chest constricted with hope and disbelief. I found myself emitting long, gasping sobs. When I'd regained my voice, I asked, "Why aren't we dead? The overhang can't float without the lithophiles. Why aren't we drowning?" She rose and sat cross-legged, massaging her bruised calf, distracted for a moment. Then she looked at me, took the measure of my misunderstanding, shook her head, and patiently explained. No one touched the lithophiles in the overhang. The militia sent divers to the edge of the Guillot and pumped in primer to make the lithophiles degas the reef rock up just above the basalt. Water flooded in, and the surface rock at the center is heavier than the water. She smiled sunnily. I look at it this way. We've lost a city, but we've gained a lagoon. And that, unfortunately, is where I have to call it for today. Sorry about the late start. Sorry for the abrupt ending, Nicole Berlino. I apologize. We do have one more installment, which I hope to do this Friday. But it is possible that Friday will be a bust. So I am going to keep my options open. If I do it Friday, it will wind up being later, probably. But I do kind of want to bang this puppy out before the end of the month, certainly. But we'll see. Next week will also be quite short. It will be part 4 of the novel. And we will see what happens. I'll keep people posted on the Discord as to what my schedule is going to look like. If you want to have that knowledge, then the Discord is where you'll have to go. If anybody finds a better alternative to Discord, I am all ears. Given that that particular service platform has been on a fairly intense enshittification curve of late, which is sad and annoying, but here we are. So yeah, once we're done with this book, we will move straight on to Cytine by C.J. Cherryh, which I'm pretty excited to get around to. It's been a little while since I've reread that one myself, but I have a fair memory of the basic outline. Blurrier, however, is the outline of Regenesis, its sequel. I do not remember a whole lot that happens in that one. It is fairly self-contained, but does... or self-contained in that, like, not a lot happens. It's not self-contained in the sense that you can read it separate from Cytine. It is a direct sequel. It kind of mandates reading Cytine to understand what's going on. But yeah, my schedule is all rocky and annoying. And yes, what hasn't, indeed. I would like to get around to reading Enshittification on stream. I was going to do it when it released, when my copy came in, but then I saw that Cory Doctorow had actually done an audiobook had done an audio release of it, which he read himself, which I urge you to check out. I might still wind up doing it anyway. It's not like I get money from these, and I generally am pretty sure YouTube should not be showing ads in any of my stuff, certainly not during it. If it ever does, tell me, and I will go poke around and see if I can fix that. At any rate, I've got a dip. A pleasure as always. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. I'll keep you posted. Stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other, and I'll see you all next time. Toodaloo!